So, change. Let's see. If you had to describe how you feel about change with one of these words, which one would it be? How many would say they love change? Oh, quite a few. Great. Who are the haters? It's okay. Who hates change? Okay, you are very brave because we all hate it a little bit depending on what it is, right? So thank you. And who tolerates change? Because you have to, right? Yeah. Yep. Me too. So I'd like to get an idea from you guys why you chose this session today. So we do have the mics, and is there anyone in the audience who would like to share the reason why they thought they wanted to come to this session? What did you think you might want to get out of it? Anybody? Oh, good. Some folks in the back there?
I'm an area manager for a pet sitting company,
Uh-huh.
and I always want to better myself as a leader.
Great.
And pass that on and be able to delegate.
Fabulous. Thank you. Anyone else? Right there in the blue? Right there in the, yeah. We can make a game out of this. Who can get the microphone to you quickest?
We're in the process of building a much larger shelter building, and in doing that, we're going to have to take in more animals. We're going to deal with more volunteers. We're going to deal with more paid staff. Huge change, and I need some help.
Right, huge. Great, good for you. Thank you. Let's take two more. How about you here in the lovely green and blue dress?
Hi, I have an organization that is going through a lot of growth right now, and I have a majority of my staff have been doing the same thing for a number of years. So obviously a lot of change is going to be coming at them and very quickly, and I want to be able to make sure that I can help them most effectively through that.
Fabulous, thank you. And one more, someone else over here, the gentleman in the baseball cap.
Hi, I'm an assistant animal care manager in SPCA. Looking for advice on how to affect changes, how to make changes when the changes that need to be made are ones that are being neglected by upper management, and I feel powerless to be able to do anything because I have no control over those changes.
Okay, terrific. And I think that's a really important point that you make in terms of I see a lot of change happening by mid-level management. Sometimes we have to create change at the mid-level despite upper management, and I see a lot of that, so thank you. And I think the point is that whether or not your title is executive or supervisor or manager, you can be a leader and you can be a sustainer and a catalyst for positive change for your organization. A lot of the concepts that I'm talking about here today are from a book, this book here by William Bridges. I would encourage, if any of you are undertaking and are management, middle, upper, you should read this book. It is amazing, and it talks about change in a way that is a little bit different than what we're normally used to hearing about change. Normally we say, okay, this is change, make it happen. This book really talks a lot about the psychology of change, and the psychology of change has so much to do with whether or not it's successful. So, one of the concepts in the book that William Bridges speaks about a lot is the transition curve. And you see here change, if I can get my pointer, I'm not sure if the pointer will show up. There we go. So here, change, that is a moment in time. A change is usually situational, and it comes about because someone has made the decision to change. Now, big important point is how good is that change? And as a leader, it is important that we are asking our teams, our staff, our partners to go through changes that are smart changes, right? But change is just a point in time, right? So down here, this is the timeline. Transition, on the other hand, is this curve here. It takes longer. Transition is how we react to the change. And on this side of the chart, you see productivity, confidence, competence. This is low, and this is high, right? and this is time passing. So as we go through a change, we are told we're going to have change. You're going to save 90% of all the animals entering into our shelter. We're going to double our intake. We're going to decrease our intake. We're going to save more lives than we did last year. Whatever the change is, that's a moment in time that then we have to deal with the ending of what we knew. We have to go through what's called the neutral zone, and I'll talk a little bit more about that later. But the neutral zone, as it is implied, is sort of this place where you're feeling kind of not sure, uncertain, and you think of that as negative oftentimes. That's scary. That's what some of us, hate, right? But if you use the neutral zone well, it can actually be a great asset and a great opportunity for innovation. So as people are passing through the ending of what they once knew, they spend some time in the neutral zone. As you see, productivity and confidence and competence, that's where it really dips down low. That's scary for people. But then you start to go back up, and then here is really the true new beginning. So you can say, we're going to save 90% of all animals entering our shelter, but whether or not you can actually make that happen has a lot to do on how we transition to it. So why do change efforts fail? Right? Change efforts fail a lot of times because people aren't given the adequate time for that transition period. Now, change can also fail for a number of other reasons. It can fail because you have lack of expertise, lack of resources, et cetera, et cetera. But a lot of times, change fails because we don't give people the time to move through that transition. So who's heard of this saying? Culture eats strategy for breakfast. Anybody hear that saying before? Yeah, you heard it yesterday, right? I know, I thought, oh yeah, that fits right into my presentation. So I love this because we all know our cultures as our organizations, our affiliations, and our social groups, our friends, we all have a particular culture. And you as a leader or as someone with a great idea who wants to move it forward and see a change through, you really have to be able to do that within the culture of the organization. And oftentimes, major change means a culture change. And that can be really tough for people. So helping people get through that cultural shift is really important. In terms of a shelter setting, for an example, so you work in a shelter, you got a job there because you love animals. Your shelter also euthanizes about 40% of the animals in the care, and so your culture in that shelter is one of society has failed these animals, and we're doing the best we can with the resources we have for them, and they deserve a humane death. And that's the culture within your work environment. So then your manager comes to you and says, oh, guess what? We're going to make a change. We're going to start saving 90% of all the animals in the shelter, and you guys are going to make that happen. Think about what people might think about that. So, A, the leadership needs to be able to say, we know we can do this, right? Because people, first off, are going to be like, what? We can't do this. If we could do this, why have we been killing all these animals for so long? So we really have to put this change in front of our people in a way that allows them to go through that transition and sometimes embrace a whole new culture. So this cartoon I love. So apropos, right? So is it the bus or the breakfast factor? There's a book, I think it's Good to Great, that says, you need to get the right people on the bus. And we're saying culture eats strategy for breakfast. And so I often ask myself, in the shelter situation, there's a lot of no-kill people who say, oh, you have to oust the leadership and you have to get entirely new staff in order to switch from this culture of killing, so to speak, to this no-kill culture. And that is not necessarily the case. Now, it can be the case. And we'll talk a little bit more later about why it might be the case. But oftentimes, you don't need to kick people off the bus. You just need to remember that culture eats strategy for breakfast, and you have to deal with that and help your team through. So in terms of helping your team create a new reality, this chart here talks about what we really need to look at when we're creating a new reality. We have our current reality down in the corner there. That's what we're currently doing. Change happens because we want to get to a new reality. We want to fulfill a new vision. A vision is what the world will look like when we do what we want to do, when we're successful with this change. And so obviously, in terms of getting from a current reality to a new reality, there is a lot of tension along the way, primarily because there's a lot of changes that have to happen. There's a lot of neutral zone situations happening that you have to help people get through. But again, that's where a lot of the beautiful new ideas and innovative ideas come from. So these are the things you also need to help you get there. You need the new vision. You need achievement measures, so you need to be able to show your team how we're going to measure the success of this change. How are we going to see if what we're doing is working? You need to develop your key strategies. What are we going to do, and why are we doing it? And you have to have the organizational capabilities and capacity. A lot of change efforts fail because people may put the cart in front of the horse, and they don't really have the organizational capabilities and capacity. However, on the flip side, a lot of organizations who are too cautious won't take risks. You might not have everything you need, but it may still be prudent to jump in and do it. So finding that balance is really important as a leader. So when you have a change with your team, you really need to sell the problem. So what problem is it that we're trying to address, why we need to change, right? In an animal shelter setting, it's probably, we believe there are too many animals dying. That's the problem, right? And then you need to communicate the cost of not addressing the problem. Why is this change necessary? And in the animal welfare industry, it's oftentimes, well, there's going to be public outcry because we've seen that no-kill works. Other communities have done it, so why aren't we doing it? There's going to be elections that could be won or lost based on this issue. So for our local leaders, that's a biggie. If we don't address this problem, you may not be elected mayor next year. And there's, of course, the ethics. And we now know there are tools within our reach where we can save these animals' lives. So we do have an obligation to do our best to get there. Selling the problem, too, requires leadership to really model the behavior of the change. We are all in the same boat. I recently asked my team to take on an unanticipated change, one that we hadn't planned for. And so I got right in the boat with them. And because I was asking them to disrupt their lives. I was asking them to do more with the same amount of hours in the day. I was asking them to put stuff on top. But there was an opportunity that came that just made sense to take. I gathered them around. They agreed that this was an opportunity we wanted to seize, but I got right down in there with them. I worked late hours. I got an email. I got way into the weeds of an issue, which normally I don't do, because this was a new, scary, unplanned change. I had to get right in the boat with my team. And trust is a biggie too, and really that's, when you're going through a change effort, there's a lot of uncertainty, so you really do need to do what you say and say what you do. And if you don't know, say, I don't know, right? Very good. It's also very important to gauge the feelings of the people around you in terms of what makes you nervous about this change and what makes you excited. This is a really great exercise to just get people to start to think about change and let them know that you care about how they feel about the change, right? So an exercise that really is just this. Okay, put up some flip charts. What about this change makes you nervous? Go around the room. What about it makes you excited? And it can also be mad, sad, glad, incensed, joyful, ecstatic. I mean, you'll see a whole spectrum of people's different feelings. And so giving people a forum where they can safely tell you those feelings and know that there won't be repercussions for honestly communicating them is really important. You want to solicit input on the how. How are we going to make this change together? You know, a lot of us in leadership sometimes we were back in the trenches 20 years ago, and so we kind of have an idea of the how ourselves, and sometimes we forget to bring in the people who are doing the how right now. And so bringing your team together, another exercise that's great is, what should we keep doing to solve the problem? What are we doing now that's great and good, and we need to keep it to be successful? What should we stop doing to solve the problem? And what do we need to start doing to solve the problem? And this is where the fun comes in, because you can have a lot of great brainstorming and wonderful ideas about what we can do. So in soliciting input on the solution, you want to solicit the input from, your team, the people it's going to impact, right? You want to ask them, what do you need from management to help you solve this problem? And if you ask this question as a leader, you better be willing to do some of the things that they come up with. You need to ask, what do you need from others? What can you do individually? This is a great one. Just one thing, a lot of change, people will start doing different things differently down the road, but if you ask them at the onset, what do you think? What's the one thing you think you could do differently right now to help us start on this journey towards this new vision, this new reality? And then what do you need from your team? What can your team do to help us springboard to our new vision? Also very important to solicit and share input from the outside. Groupthink, silos, blah, blah, blah. So really, you want to get input from the outside. I do this a lot in my role, is I take model programs, things that have worked elsewhere that you great people are doing in many cases. I'm like, that is awesome. I'm going to steal that idea, and I'm going to help so-and-so do it. And oftentimes, we say, so I go and say, we were a lot like you. When I come in from the outside, I say, look, this shelter was a lot like you, but not exactly. Why? Why? Because everybody says, when you say, hey, this great thing happened here, here you go, you should do it. They go, we're not like them. We're different. And that's true. And I say, yes, that is true. You are different. You're not exactly like this other shelter, but there are enough similarities where we feel this will work for you. So you can have people who have successfully done these changes come in and say, look, we encountered unique obstacles in our community. It wasn't the perfect model. It wasn't just, we couldn't can it and open it and have it be perfect, but we were able to get through them, and we think you will too. And we're so glad we did it, even though it was scary. So these are a lot of the messages that when you bring in someone from the outside who has successfully gone through a similar change, these are the messages that you'd like them to impart. This is an example of this in terms of Best Friends does a number of community CAP programs across the country, and it really involves great coordination and cooperation with animal enforcement officers. And yet, when I come in, I'm like some middle-aged woman from a nonprofit who's never been an animal control officer, much less even worked in a shelter. Do you know how much credibility I have? So this is a way that I attempted to show the message from their peers.
One of my toughest jobs leading animal control officers was getting them to think along these new lines. And at first, a lot were very resistant. A lot felt it was not really what their job was supposed to be. But over time, they've actually become some of the strongest advocates because they're seeing the positive. They're seeing the number of cats go down in the neighborhoods. They're seeing people caring for cats, less cruelty, and now they can concentrate on the more difficult things like dog bites and other cruelty issues that are more important to the community. One of the things my officers and actually my whole staff really like about TNR is that we have been able to eliminate over 100 euthanasias per day, and the morale has been at a peak high. And unlike most shelters, we have zero turnover.
Thank you for the loan.
So that's a shortened version of actually a 5-minute video that interviews a bunch of animal control officers. And I didn't want to show the whole thing here, but it's really a great resource for me to be able to use that because I'm going in and saying, here are your peers who have actually were super skeptical about these community cat projects, and rightly so, because it's completely a shift in culture. These animal enforcement officers, they've been fulfilling their role and gaining their kind of measure of success on how many cats they can bring in off the street. And what we're telling them is we're completely shifting that measure of success by saying, oh yeah, now the goal is how many we can put back out. I mean, that's like a huge culture shift, and we're naive to think that they would be automatically on board and ready to go with that idea. I mean, that's silly of us. So testing your assumptions is a huge part of change as well. Here are some of the ones that I've heard. So cat owners are more irresponsible than dog owners. This was a question I posed to a shelter director who you know, their cat euthanasia rate and intake rate was much higher than their dog rate. And I asked him why he thought that was the case. And he said, because cat owners are more irresponsible than dog owners. And he really believed that. He had been in that role for 19 years. And so it took me a lot of dialogue to say, well, how about this for an alternative maybe reason? Cats operate very differently in our communities than dogs. They're not, you know, dogs, if they're running in a pack, a group, they're much more noticeable. Cats are able to live outside and survive much more readily than dogs can. You know, all this conversation about why he assumed that there were more cats coming into the shelter than dogs. Poor people shouldn't have pets. That's one that I used to have, and I'm really ashamed of that. People don't value a free pet. This is a biggie that our movement has been working on to remedy for a long time. This idea that if you do reduced or no cost fee adoptions, that, you know, you're only going to bring in people who want to cook them for dinner, you know? And you really have to test those assumptions. I love this quote. We cannot solve our problems with the same thinking we used when we created them. And an example of this, I think, is this idea that we said for so many years in our movement. Too many animals, not enough homes. That came about through thinking that, okay, our shelter's full, no one's coming to adopt. That means there aren't enough homes. If people don't want to adopt, they want, or this, they come in to adopt, and the animal that they currently have isn't sterilized, so they don't deserve a second pet. They obviously can't afford a second pet, and so they shouldn't have one. It was that kind of thinking that I think led to us all saying for so many years that there are, you know, too many animals and not enough homes, which now the data shows nationally that there are 17 million people looking to bring an animal into their home every year, and with approximately 3.5, 4 million animals dying, on a national scale, we have enough homes. Now I realize there may be pockets of communities where that may be true. But overarchingly, I think it's not true in many communities. There are enough homes. So we've solved these problems by thinking differently. When we're thinking about the public doesn't know about the great animals we have to adopt. The public doesn't realize that we are a great place to find that lifelong loving pet. Or, boy, we need to look at these animals more like a retail marketing endeavor, because that's what it's really all about. If you can't get the animals known to the public, of course, they're not going to get adopted. So now what you're seeing is more shelters really thinking about adoption like retail. And I hate to use the word inventory, but so no, that I'm not making animals inventory, but really moving animals through the system takes a retail mind of thinking in terms of think of inventory. If you have too much inventory, you got to do new things to move them faster. And so now that we're thinking more retail-like in our industry, we're finding more and more animals' homes. So I wanted to go over a little bit of the differences between animal sheltering in the 1980s and animal sheltering today. We've come a long way. Look at that. You know, we were killing about 17 million animals a year back in the 80s. Wow. Whew. But in 1980s, our animal enforcement officers really thought mostly more animals off the street equals safer communities. Whereas today, we're saying we're going to solve for why animals are on the street. Why is that animal running loose? Is it because it's not neutered and it's going after another dog? Is it because this person doesn't have an adequate fence? Is it because they neglect it, et cetera, et cetera? So we're doing more than just animal on the street, take it off equals better, to, okay, let's try to solve for the reason why animals are on the street in the first place. In the 1980s, it really was animals deserve a humane death was kind of the overarching thought process. And today we're saying animals deserve to live. And I am so grateful to work for Best Friends, who I think the founders of Best Friends were the pioneers of some of that change there. In the 1980s, shelter pets were considered damaged goods, and today, more and more, shelter pets are considered cool. It's like a badge of courage. Oh, where'd you get your dog? I adopted it, you know? People are really excited about that. They love to identify with rescuing an animal. It's awesome. In the 1980s, we really thought the public is irresponsible. That's why we have pet homelessness. You know, the first time I ever stepped foot in a shelter, I was 16 years old, and I just got my driver's license. And I found a dog running loose, and I took it to my local shelter, and I was super naive. 3 days later, I went back, and the dog hadn't gotten adopted, but I thought, well, since I brought it, they'll just give it back to me, right? You know, hey. So I went, and I said, okay, I know the dog didn't get adopted. Can I, I'll take the dog back. And they said, well, you can't take the dog back. It's our property now, and you'd have to adopt the dog, and we need your parents to come in, and, all logical, sensible things. And I was upset, so I started calling, and my mom said, yeah, okay, you can put the dog at the garage for a while until we try to find a home for it, right? Because I was crying. And so I get off the phone, and I say, okay, my mom said, we could take the dog. And the shelter worker said, well, the dog has gotten sick since it's been here, and so we have to euthanize the dog. And I was just heartsick. I just started sobbing right in the middle of the floor, and this poor woman, who worked at the shelter was doing the best she could to console me. And she said, and I was like, there's got to be something that could be done. And she said, well, you could go in, you could volunteer for us, going in and talking to elementary school kids about how to be responsible pet owners. That was the only thing she could offer me. Now, this was the 1980s. So, but today, what's cool is that now the solutions that our shelter workers are able to give to people aren't around, well, we just have to teach people to be more responsible. We're saying, no, the public wants to do the right thing, and we want to offer them solutions and resources to do the right thing by their pets. And in the 80s, the facilities were built to hold and kill. I mean, that facility wasn't built to keep that animal healthy, not in the 80s, but today you're seeing facilities that are built to house and adopt. So there's huge changes that have happened between the 1980s and today. Again, the spay-neuter issue, trap-neuter return, funding for animal shelters has changed fairly dramatically, although I'm surprised still at how archaic a lot of funding models are for shelters. But a lot of changes. And of course, if you've seen in our wonderful banners out in the hallways here, back in the 80s, there weren't any no-kill communities, and now there's more than 200, and that's the best of the best. So, if your shelter isn't no-kill, does it mean you're stuck in the 80s? Is this what you are doomed to? Maybe. Maybe there are some outdated policies and practices that you really need to take a hard look at, but maybe not. There's also resource issues, capacity issues, expertise issues that we talked about earlier. And those issues also lack of political will and lack of the leadership to be able to take their teams through change and through transition. That's a big barrier. This is another book that I love because we're talking a lot today about the psychology of change and helping people get through this kind of chaos and uncertainty and sometimes resistance. But if you're looking at ways that you can negotiate with your government kind of to address some of these other issues here, lack of collaboration, lack of political will, if you're looking at, well, we really need to negotiate with our government to get more out of them, et cetera, this is a really great book. negotiation strategies for reasonable people. And when I pulled this out to do this presentation, it was funny because I've been having a really kind of difficult situation. You know, I've been working with some difficult people lately. And I pulled this book out and I was like, oh yeah, they have to be reasonable people. I forgot that. But this is a really great book, and one of the things in this book that I love is in terms of how we create a strategy of bargaining and negotiating and trying to get our governments to change to support more life-saving or whatever change we're looking at. You look at the perceived conflicts over the stakes of the issue, whether they're high or low really depends on how you might deal with the situation, and also the perceived importance of future relationship between the parties. And this is one that in our movement, you see all the time, because there's some no-kill advocates who really are strong voices and really quite hostile ones sometimes. They say, you are killers, you are murderers, we need change, we need new leadership, we need a new shelter director, this is awful, horrible. And you know what? They provide a very valuable role in some situations, because governments oftentimes won't change unless there is public outcry. And yet, sometimes you see those same people, you know, then once the government says, okay, yeah, we want to go to no-kill, then they think that they can actually partner with the shelter to get them there. And yet, they forgot one important thing here, that it's important to have a good relationship with the shelter if you're going to then partner with them on life-saving and collaborate. So sometimes, if you're going to be that rebel rouser, and that may be the right choice and the right time for your community, you got to be realistic about how feasible is it going to be for me to then partner with these people I've been attacking for 2 years. Or you think, okay, is there another organization that can come in and help provide that collaborative approach and problem solving later on? These are important issues, and Best Friends oftentimes plays that role in terms of we'll come in as sort of the moderate. We really don't use the attack methods. I mean, we have legislation and advocacy, and we fight for issues, but we typically don't make them personal, right? And so here, if you have balanced concerns, like the perceived conflict over the stakes is high, and it's very likely that you're going to need to have a relationship with these people later on. If you're the only ones that can help them actually get to no-kill, then you're going to have to look at problem solving and compromise as part of how you're going to bargain and negotiate with those guys. But if your relationship with them later on down the road is going to be low, you can play a little more hardball, right? You can be a little more competitive. And yet still, what I love about this graph is that problem solving and compromise is in every 4 quadrants of this. And I think the lesson is if you can compromise and everybody wins, then that, of course, is better for all of us. So this one over here, relationships, that's like, you know, you husband-wife, you know, relationship. Like, you know, if your husband wants to do, like, oh, should we go to the Grand Canyon or Bryce Canyon today? I mean, you're going to, like, accommodate. You're going to be like, oh, yeah, honey, you know what, let's just do what you want to do. You use a lot of accommodation and problem-solving compromise when you have really close relationships, people. Tacit coordination is something like you're at a traffic light, right? Or stop sign, and you both arrive at the same time. And that's just like this little tiny moment in time where you're like, okay, yeah, you go first. Yeah, okay. And so you can either just avoid and let the other person go, accommodation and compromise. A lot of what we're doing in the animal welfare world is going to be in these 2 quadrants here, where we have a high relationship between parties, and sometimes a lower relationship between parties, but high perceived conflicts over stakes. So this is where we often work in animal welfare. When you as leaders decide you want to do a change, I mean, obviously, the change is the change. You've already made the decision to make the change, but deciding what changes are the right changes is a really important part of your role as a leader. And so really filtering that through what I like to call the desired outcome filter helps you think about, okay, why? Why do we want this change? And I love to do an exercise that says, why at least 5 times, right? Because you really want to determine the root cause. Yeah, you want to be like an obnoxious 2-year-old. Why? For instance, protect people and pets, anti-tethering laws. Why should we have anti-tethering laws? Well, because dogs on chains are bad. Why are dogs on chains bad? Well, dogs on chains are bad because it's bad for the dog. Well, why is it bad for the dog? Well, they don't give enough exercise. They don't get enough human interaction. They don't. Why else? Oh, because it puts people at risk, because it's a health and safety issue. We know data shows that dogs on chains are more likely to bite people. So you really have to go through and ask yourself why 5 times to kind of come with what's the root cause, and then what do we want to do about it? So if dogs on chains are the problem, and we want to solve for that, and we know why we want to solve for it is because we want to protect people and pets, should we cite people for their dogs on chains, or should we build them a fence? Who goes for citing? Oh, you're a smart group. Maybe you do need to cite. It's right. I love it. You know what? I go by the 3 Bs. This is my mantra for how I deal with life. You always bribe first, then you beg, then you bully. So a citation may be appropriate, and maybe building a fence would actually be a root cause solution that would keep that dog happier and keep the public safer. So root cause solutions. Oftentimes we change things in a way that we're not successful because it doesn't get to the root cause of what we're trying to solve for, right? And sometimes, I love this, Scott Trebetowski, he was in the video with the ACO video that you saw, and back then he was with Jacksonville, and now he's with Hillsborough. And he changed the name of the Hillsborough Municipal Shelter, I can't remember what it was before, but he changed it to Pet Resource Center. Now, if he had just changed the name without also putting forth a lot of new operational changes, helping his team transition to new cultural changes, helping with the uncertainty and the fear of that, probably changing the name in and of itself would have done nothing. But he's doing all the other work as well, so good for him. Another big part of, I think, my challenges as a leader when I'm trying to manage change and expectations of my staff is that on my teams I have these people who are like, they're the planners, and then I have these other people who are the jumper-inners, right? And a lot of my job is spent finding balance between the two of them because they're both very necessary. But if we sat and planned everything and got every T crossed and every I dotted before we did anything, you'd never do anything, right? But if you jump in with at least the bare bones of adequate planning, you might risk the whole thing failing because you didn't plan for something that was really important that you needed right from the get-go. So as a leader, oftentimes your role is to be able to find the balance between your doers and your planners. And walking a mile in their shoes is such a great tool to help your teams through change. I know a lot of shelters I deal with, they say, we have no travel budget, we have no money, we can't go see what other people are doing. And I wish there were more funders who would fund that kind of mentorship opportunity where people get to go and actually see and walk a mile in the shoes. Like San Antonio Animal Care Services, they are so amazing. They have mentored so many other shelters who want to start community cat projects that are based on return to field. Best Friends has been partnering with PetSmart Charities and Animal Care Services on a program there. Started in 2012. We just exited out in March of this year, and the shelter took the whole program over. And they have been so kind to allow other shelters to come in, and they do actual workshops with them. Okay, this is, if you want to start a program like this is what you need to do with the media, blah, blah, blah. So being able to show your team what other people who have been through this change are doing and how they relate to it is so, so valuable. And saying goodbye. So my husband was watching me look this over on the plane, and he said, are they leaving their dog behind after getting married? I was like, no, of course not. Yeah, if the dog makes it on top of the wedding cake, he's gonna stick around, right? So I just want to make that clear. I promised I would clarify for you that these people are not leaving their dog behind. But I love this quote because the reason I have the wedding cake there is because marriage is one of those changes that we wholeheartedly say, hey, I'm in. I want to do this, right? And most of us have a moment of fear, uncertainty, regret, because we are leaving a part of ourselves behind. So even the most longed-for changes, like saving all the healthy and treatable animals in our shelter, as wonderful and as longed for as that change may be, there's still going to be some grief. So we really need to help our teams work through that grief, guilt, and most of all, resistance, because this is something I see all the time. And I think an easy way to help people do that is to respect the past, to acknowledge their uncertainty and fear, and to commit to the future. That can be kind of easier said than done, right? But in terms of sheltering, respecting the past, look, we did the best we could with the resources we had in that point and time. It's okay. It's okay that we only saved 40% of the animals back then. And yet now we know we can do better. We know it's scary. We know it's going to require a lot of change. We know that you may suddenly feel a lack of confidence in your role because roles are going to have to change. You're going to have to maybe learn a new skill set. This is all scary stuff. So we know that that's scary to you. And believe you me, we're going to help you work through it. We're going to create ways to support you through it. And we need your commitment. Getting that commitment to the future is so important. Sometimes when people this is a lot of times in a work environment, if you haven't helped them through the transition and they can't even think about embracing this new culture, what you'll get sometimes is malicious compliance, where they're doing it, they're complying, but on the flip side, they're sabotaging the effort in the background. And that cannot be tolerated. So you have to have a short amount of tolerance for that, right? Even though you're helping people through the transition stage, if people are performing malicious compliance, you need to help them along for a bit, but then you may need to help them out the door. That compliance sometimes is though okay. Look, sometimes you can't actually, commitment is what we want to strive for. We want you to commit. We want you to say, that new vision up there, that new reality, I love it. Ooh, sorry. I share that new vision, and I'm with you. That's what you want. And sometimes you have to settle for compliance. Like, all right, well, I think it's kind of stupid, but you're my boss, and you've told me that I have to do it, so I'm gonna do it. And sometimes that's okay, at least in the beginning, because a lot of times that will evolve into commitment. So there you go. I don't want to underestimate the power of the neutral zone. And when I love this quote because all great changes are preceded by chaos. And for the people who did admit that they hate change, a lot of people I talk to who hate change, it's this chaos. They are people who love things to be tidy, and we need people like that on our teams for sure. They help often us lead out of the neutral zone because they want to get things back tidy and good. So they're like, all right, we got to work through this chaos because I need to normalize again. And so I really want to reiterate that point. The neutral zone, you want to define it. I often define it, I think the neutral zone, that's the term that William Bridges uses. I like to use the term more creative tension, because creative tension seems to say there is an opportunity for us to innovate through these challenges. Some of the best solutions that I've come up with are when we're head up against a huge obstacle with people that we don't like very much, and we have to figure it out. And sometimes that's where the greatest new, most innovative, brightest new ideas come from in moments like that. So then you're like, oh, that's cool. I'll put myself in that chaotic, scary place because something really great may come out of it. You do need to create stopgaps for your team during the neutral zone. So those are like the short win, like small wins that you can do in short order. Give them little, small, baby step benchmarks that you know they can meet and you can celebrate those. And allow for innovation. So sometimes as leaders, particularly, we're like, oh, there's going to be this change, and we know it's going to be chaotic, but I want to control the chaos as much as possible, and so I'm not going to let anybody have any real new ideas. You really have to, as a leader, allow yourself to share that same uncertainty, chaos, and not try to get everything back into order too quickly, because sometimes that will be counterproductive. You'll want to celebrate your wins for sure. This is big. When you're asking your team to take on a new change, even those short-range goals, when you hit them, do something. Give everybody, a cookie. Just say thank you in an email. Really celebrate those small short-term wins. And you do want to create and communicate a plan, because obviously having something of a plan in place is very important. But while you're in the neutral zone, you don't want to get too attached to the plan. So you've done all that work that we talked about earlier, right? You've gotten people's input about how should we go about this change. That helps inform your plan. You're like, okay, this is the plan. But while you're in the neutral zone, what you're going to find out is sometimes the stuff in that plan is not going to work. That's okay. That's part of change. That's part of this. So as leaders, sometimes once we have the plan, we get too attached to it. So be willing to say, oh yeah, you know what, that ain't working. Let's get back to the drawing board. And really a great way to do that is to solicit the staff's feedback about, okay guys, so we're 90 days into this change, what's working about it, what's not, what's next. You can literally do this and ask people to say, you've got 30 seconds, give me the one thing that's working well, the one thing that's not, and what do you want to see next? And you can do that in kind of like a guerrilla speed dating sort of style. One of the things I do want to give a red flag warning about is this idea of change for change's sake. And there are some people who are actually kind of addicted to change. And William Bridges defines them, and I'm paraphrasing here, as people who they don't want to have to be responsible for sustaining the change, so they're constantly change agents. And they want change for change's sake because they don't want to actually do the hard work of then sustaining the change. And so you do have to be wary of these people, because these people oftentimes are very charismatic in getting people to, oh, we need to make this change. And then they start off and then suddenly they're like, you're like, where are you? And they've moved on to the next change. So word of caution there. So William Bridges says we have 4 P's for the new beginning. Way back in the beginning slide, we talked about that transition to the new beginning. Helping your team really get rallied around that new beginning. You need to have a purpose behind the results you're seeking. So of course, that's again sort of like, what's the problem that we want to solve? Why are we doing this? You want to paint a picture of how achieving the new reality will look and feel. When we are saving 90% of all the animals in our care, we are going to save 4.5 hours of time that was spent euthanizing animals, and now we can use that towards better investigation of cruelty cases, doing behavioral work with our animals, providing better enrichment for the animals that are in our care. You really need to paint that picture of what that new reality is going to look like. And then share the plan, of course, we're getting there, and I put the asterisks here in terms of share the plan and give each person a part to play. Back to that same idea of get their input on the plan and let them give you input on what part they want to play. There was recently, I was doing some facilitations and asking people, okay, so your shelter has decided that you're going to save all the healthy and treatable animals in your shelter. What's the one thing you are going to do? What's the part you feel you're going to play? And this was someone who is a euthanasia technician. And they said, I'm going to work on changing my role. I'm going to define my new role. And I was like almost in tears. I was like, that is a brave, wonderful change agent and great leader. What a wonder. Instead of someone saying, oh my God, I might not have a job, hey, I'm going to define my new role. It was really awesome. So a successful change agent has some characteristics. Active listener, so asking people, learning by inquiry, really listening. Listening is not sitting there and hearing someone, like, we're really in the back of your mind, you're like, oh, what should I have for dinner? Oh, yeah. Listening is really listening and helping that person solve their own problems, right? I'm a problem solver type, so I'd be like, okay, what's your problem? And my team would tell me, and I'd be like, okay, this is how you solve it. And I've now learned through active listening that it's better if I say, well, so what do you think are the key barriers to doing it differently? Or, well, they'll joke. They'll be like, yeah, you say, well, what would you do? But it often goes into a little more detail than that. But really, listening actively is a key part. And then also in terms of influencing by inquiry, so let me ask you, how many people intend to vote in their next election? Awesome. I just increased your chance of voting in the next election by a huge percentage. Simply by inquiring and asking that question, because you were proactively saying, I'm going to do something. I didn't say you're going to do something. You should vote in the next election. Be a responsible voter. Be a patriotic American. I was saying, are you going to vote in the next election? And you committed yourself. It was your idea. And so just that simple difference between you saying, hey, how would you like to see us save more lives, can help be a catalyst to gaining that commitment to saving more lives. So really understanding the psychology of transition, read the William Bridges book, really does help the team productively deal with the tension. You want to be tactful and compassionate, but you can't be a pushover. So some of the balance is how long do I allow some people to be in the neutral zone, or how long do I try to bargain and collaborate and compromise and accommodate? And at some point you may have to decide, okay, now at this point, I've tried to help get you through, and sometimes people do have to be asked to get off the bus. And you need a really successful change agent can recognize and nurture the potential in others around them. And that is setting up all these ways that they can give input and brainstorm and ideas on how they can co-create the solution and empowering them to do that. A successful change agent influences with inquiry. That's what I talked about when I was saying, how many of you are going to vote? This is a big one. Doesn't overreact to resistance and grief. I'm a highly reactive person. It's probably, I would say, my main challenge as a leader. I'm a redhead. So am I genetically predispositioned to have a temper? I could say that, but that could be kind of like pro-breed discriminatory, right? So I'm not gonna say that. But what I'm saying is, when I was a little girl, people would see me and they'd say to my mom, oh, I bet she's a handful, little temper on that one, fiery one. And so ever since I was little, I sort of was grown up with this expectation that I could be kind of bitchy. And I've really had to do a lot to learn to counteract how I overreact to resistance and grief, because I do overreact. My initial reaction is usually pretty fiery. And then, thank goodness I do a lot of my work remotely via email, so I can write that crazy email that I'm never gonna send. And then the next day I can go back to it and go, okay, let's get back to the core issue. What's the underlying issue of this person's resistance and grief, and how can I help steer them out of it rather than reacting to their resistance and grief by resistance and grief myself? Let's get back to the underlying issue that we're all trying to solve for. A successful change agent is a skilled negotiator. And back to that other work, are they a collaborator? In our movement, I've seen really successful efforts that have had amazing collaboration, and really successful efforts that don't focus as much on collaboration. Someone said to me once, and I love this, they said, don't collaborate unless you have to. And it really is good advice, because why do you want to collaborate if it's not going to be better for you and them? If it's not going to raise all boats higher, why do you go through the grief of having to deal with completely different organization, different bureaucracy, different this, different that? But sometimes when you are forced to collaborate, when you know that you can't do it without one another, and when you commit to, well, we want to make a difference in this community, we can't do it as fast and as well without each other, you can come up with some of the most amazing ideas that you could never come up with by yourself. But sometimes you shouldn't collaborate. And a good, successful change agent will know when. A good, successful change agent solicits feedback and acts on it. I'm talking real feedback, and feedback about what's working, what's not, what's next, but also feedback about their own leadership. Because when you're trying to lead people through a major change, sometimes you get a little wrapped up in your own ego, and so you really do need to solicit from your team, how am I doing as a leader? And that's a tough question to ask because A, are they going to give you the right answer? Like, well, you could fire me if I tell you how I really feel, you know? A 360 kind of tool, who's heard of a 360? So those are great tools to solicit feedback. Now, the problem is if you get that real feedback from something like a 360, which is a way that people can give you feedback on an online form that then tallies all the answers, and you can say, how am I doing as a leader? If you get that feedback and then you don't act on it, you know, what is it worth? So if you solicit feedback as a leader and you get the feedback from your team, you better act on it. My team told me, I did a 360, and they were like, Holly, we get a win, we accomplish this great thing, and then you're like, okay, what's next? And they found that really frustrating because I wasn't giving them, I was like, yay, celebrate, we had a party, we're so good, yeah. Okay, let's go on to the next thing. And my team was tired, right? They said, you don't give us any time to breathe. So that was really great feedback for me. And so now I do more debriefs, and I am much more deliberate about giving my team some time to rest before I throw another new challenge right at them. How many of you feel like this? Right? Yay! A really great leader and change agent is able to balance the urgent with important, because when you're going through a new change, things happen unexpectedly all the time, and you've got to sometimes turn on a dime and completely do something different that day than you had originally planned, and sometimes that's the right way to go. And other times you also need to be able to say, okay, I have to get what is not urgent, but what is important. And this is one moment where I'd love to get some feedback from you guys on how do you guys do this? How do you balance urgent with important in your worlds? Can we get the mics going? And I'd love to get some of you all. Does anybody have ways that they balance urgent with important? All right, well, you needed this session then. They're really, so I block out my important time on my calendar and say, for my long-term planning and my stuff that I know is really important, but isn't smacking me in the face right then, I block out time on my calendar. Some people use what I think is called a Kanban board, where you have a need to do, doing, done, and you make sure you put your important stuff on it, and you actually physically, and then on Post-it notes, you can physically move it over, and it's sort of like really, it's so 1980s, it's so low tech. But I found that helpful because on my calendar I'd have my to-do list, but it would get so overwhelmingly long, and I started kind of color-coding priorities. It just got too much for me. But that might work for some people. But a Kanban board, if you have it staring at you, and it's staring at you in front of your desk every day, and you're like, oh, that important thing that I put on here that I keep not doing because all this urgent stuff hijacks me every day, it's sitting there staring at you every day, and you kind of go like, okay, I better get to this. So those are a few suggestions. There's a lot of great resources online that you can look this up. Okay, we've got somebody who wants to share a strategy. Awesome. Right up front here. Balancing urgent with important. She's right here in the blue. Yeah, way up front. Yeah, we're giving you your workout today.
kind of a Stephen Covey strategy that I use is big rocks and small rocks. And so each week at the beginning of the week, I decide what my big rocks are, whether they're around my rescue work or my personal life or whatever. Make sure to put those in, not more than usually 4 or 5, and put those in. Those are not negotiable. I'm going to do them when I said I was going to do them, regardless of what urgent comes up. So if it's, and then every night, of course, I have time set aside to do my work, my rescue work, the things that I need to do for my part of it. And so if something urgent comes up within that, if I'm doing ARR work and I have my big rocks within that and something urgent comes up, I just need to decide if this can wait. And a lot of times those things can wait a little bit, especially to build in a buffer depending upon what the situation is. If someone's panicking about something, a lot of times if I allow them a buffer of a few hours or a day. So big rocks, small rocks is kind of my approach to it.
Thank you. I had a coach tell me once, now she didn't have an animal welfare background, so sorry everybody, but I remembered it. She said, before you eat lunch every day, swallow a frog. What? And what she was saying was, before you allow yourself to have lunch, do the one thing that's important, but you're procrastinating and you don't want to do it. You know it's important, but it may be difficult or, unsavory a little bit. So that's one tool that I also use in terms of I do the one thing that I don't want to do before I let myself eat. Maybe that's why I'm thin. No. I choose not to eat. A successful sustainer of change. So there's good change agents who can start the change, but you also have to be able to sustain the change. Oftentimes in organizations, I see that this is not the same person. If you as a leader can do both of this, you have a lot of great skills. So you need other people around you that can be the sustainer if you're the type of leader that's the good, let's do something new on a wing and a prayer with nothing but passion and perseverance. And then you also need people who are like, okay, we did that, and now we better get a little organized around it or we're going to die, right? So a successful sustainer of change, they exhibit patient persistence. So they're not going to let stuff drop, but they have a level of patience. They find opportunity in failure. I think an example is, I love the Post-it notes. Post-it notes were a failure. That adhesive was actually supposed to adhere more. And they were like, okay, what do we do? And there was someone who said, oh, well, in Bible class, I would love to be able to have something that sticks while, people can get up with the choir book and know where to go, but it's not going to tear the paper off. They're like, oh, great, Post-it notes. And what an opportunity in that failure, right? And a multi-million-dollar business to boot. A successful sustainer of change models the new behavior. Again, you can't ask your staff to go through a big change, i.e., okay, we've got big budget cuts, so we're going to all have to tighten our belt, and then the boss goes off and flies, first class for the next business trip. You as a leader or the creator or the sustainer of change have to model the new behavior that you're asking everyone else to do. And you can lead the organization through organizational evolution. And this is another Bridges page in his book. And this really talks about organizational evolution in terms of all organizations go through something like this, where there's someone visionary dreaming the dream. I want a new way. I believe in a new way of doing something, and I'm going to make this happen. They launch the venture, often on a wing and a prayer with few resources and a lot of perseverance and just guts, right? Then, at some point, if you don't get organized, you can't operate anymore in that wing and prayer kind of method, right? Because it's total chaos. And sometimes the interesting thing is that the people who do this and this well are oftentimes people who don't do this well at all. And you get a lot of people who are the founders of organizations who, unless they realize at some point they need to bring in new other people with different skill sets to help perform this function, they may not be successful. And then, if you dream the dream, launch the venture, get it organized, and then you're succeeding, you're making it, you're doing what you want to do, then you can become an institution. And I would say institution can be a fine and good thing. It also then can be, it can either be the end of the road, because you're not keeping up with new ways of thinking, you're not trying to create new realities, you're not doing enough change, you can become too complacent in the way in which things have always been done, and you become too attached to that. And then outside threats can come in and ruin you. So you can either go through where you then might die, or you can choose a path of renewal. You can say, okay, there's This is a new day. There's new technologies, new things we need to do together as a team. So let's start to endeavor to begin anew, and then you go back to dreaming the dream. So this is organizational renewal and organizational evolution, and constant change is a part of that. A successful sustainer of change values long-term goals, but also values short-term wins. So the values long-term goal is, a professor of mine said, you have to get on the balcony. You have to be able to take the 30,000-foot view. Look at things from the broader level, right? And you also have to get down on the dance floor, get right there in the thick of it with your team. So as a leader, you have to do both if you want to sustain the change that you're trying to sustain. A successful sustainer of change holds himself, herself accountable for both the good and the bad. And that can be tough. I have a friend who, when I fail, she's a coach, and she said to me once, she's like, Holly, what did you want out of that? This is a horrible failure. I made a huge mistake, and it was a terrible end, and it was just awful. And she looked me in the eye and she said, why did you want that to happen? And I was like, of course I don't want that to happen. What do you mean? Da, 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 da. Basically, what she was telling me is, what are you going to learn from that? What is the learning opportunity in your failure? So I now hold myself accountable for the good and the bad, because the bad can be a great way for people to learn. So I'm not going to go through all of these, but these are some of just the buzzwords of a great, successful sustainer of change in terms of what they bring to an organization. I love this picture. This is a picture of Albuquerque Animal Welfare Department, who also was brave in that they were one of the first partners with PetSmart Charities and Best Friends Animal Society in this model of return to field community cat programs that we did in 2012. It's the one I mentioned, we also did in San Antonio. After 1 year of running that program, this is what their cages look like. And it's hard to see, but those cages are empty. And they had a 90% save rate. So they weren't empty because those animals were dying. So this is the typical road to no-kill. Somehow change is demanded, most often by the public themselves, sometimes by the government. The government resolves that, yes, we need to do something differently. So then the current reality is analyzed. We're saying, okay, well, we think we know what we're doing, but let's really delve into it a little bit more. What does our current reality really look like? How much spay-neuter are we doing? How many adoptions are we doing? How many people in need for services are there in our community, et cetera, et cetera. So you do a lot of analysis. Then that analysis helps you form a strategic plan. You go out and you form the partnerships as they make sense. Again, if the partnership doesn't bring all boats up, make the overall pie bigger, you have to think about, is this a good partnership? But oftentimes partnerships do that because we can share resources, we can share brain power, we have access to different audiences, but we have the same common goal. So partnerships are almost always key. Then the partners really need to know what their roles are, what the goals are, and that's what helps you create the tactics, right? So, and knowing what the roles are is so important. Who's doing what and why is super important. And then oversight and accountability. Putting those accountability measures in place are really key. And that's how typically more lives are saved on the typical road to no-kill. So I'd like to ask you guys, on a scale of 1 to 10 right now, how confident are you in leading a positive change effort? So we'll go, how many of you, so think of a change effort that you feel needs to happen. On a scale of 1 to 10, how confident are you that you can help lead that change? Who's thinking 1 to 3, low? We'll talk after. Medium. That uncertainty, right? That fear, that resistance. And high, 8 to 10? A lot of you. Wow, great. Great. Well, the most important factor for successful change is a shared belief that it can be done. Now, that doesn't mean delusional. There's a difference. But the shared belief that it can be done is oftentimes the most critical measure of being able to do this. So my final words before we take questions are, you can do it, and thank you. Now I'd like to open it up for questions. Why, thanks. Does anybody have any questions? Yes, here in the red.
Hi, I've just taken over a county animal control position as director. I've been working there as an animal control officer, but now I'm the director. I'm just kind of interested. I have a staff, some have been there for 20 years, some are kind of new, so kind of some resistance, but a lot of new people looking forward to some change. Kind of interested when you talked about that big disaster that you had. Can you kind of share with me something that you tried to implement and it actually didn't work?
Yeah, well, my disaster involves sexual harassment, so we won't go into that. But, but let me bring it back around to your situation. So there's a gentleman, his name is Vincent Medley, and I think he's the assistant director for San Antonio Animal Care Services. And he is one of the most amazing guys because he's been working as an animal control officer, then the field supervisor, now associate or assistant director, I'm not sure what the title is, for so many years. So he's gone from that, and he says it so well. He says, I went from this culture of, my whole thing was I never thought about the animal after I dropped it off, and that wasn't my role. It's not how I measured success, and quite frankly, I didn't care much about it. And he says now, we can no longer do that as animal enforcement officers. We have to be willing to understand the entire system in which we work, and that includes from start to finish. And so no longer can we ask ourselves to only know and work within a part of the system. So being able, I don't know what your setup is in terms of being able to show the animal control officers, sometimes the compliance thing works really well in an animal shelter and in animal enforcement particularly because these guys know hierarchy. They know, they're used to working within a hierarchy. You know you were in it. And so sometimes you have to settle for compliance and then hope for commitment later. Another great example is in our community cats project in Baltimore. The animal enforcement is separate from the shelter, and so that makes it harder because there's two cultures, there's different influencers, different management, but we wanted to do this community cats project, this return to field project, which required the buy-in and actual cooperation of the animal enforcement officers. They hated it. They hated it in the beginning. And I almost pulled the program. And what I did is I actually brought in a third-party facilitator, and we worked through some of these exercises here, and we talked through some of the issues. And I also brought in Vincent Medley to talk about, well, yeah, we felt the same way in San Antonio. That longer video with the ACOs in Jacksonville, there's ACOs that sit there and say, we thought this was the stupidest program we'd ever heard of when we first heard of it, and now we just love it. And so being able to bring someone who's gone through that change and share their experience, one of their peers, I think might be really helpful for you. Any other questions? Okay, let's wait for the mic, please, and we'll have you on deck.
More of a, I agree with you, and I'm so glad I heard you say it, the don't collaborate unless it makes sense, because I think a lot of times as nonprofits, everybody thinks we should kumbaya collaborate, and it doesn't make sense if it takes away from what your mission is.
Right.
And sometimes you can partner and you do this and I'll do that, but I really am so glad you said that because people don't talk about it a
Yeah,
lot.
it's like sometimes collaboration makes sense, sometimes just coordination makes sense, and then sometimes cooperation is all you can hope for, a mix between competing and cooperating. Yeah, thank you. Other questions?
So quick question for you as far as being a younger person working with older people trying to make the change that they are set in their ways, they know what they're doing, you just came in here, you're too young to remember where it was before to where it is now. How do you overcome an age gap or being the new person coming in trying to make change?
That's a great question. And I would say that, A, you want to inquire to them about where it was before and let them know that you actually do value their historical knowledge. And then B, Again, bringing in people who might be closer to their age, who have gotten on board with what you're trying to, from another agency or even another field. Like, it doesn't have to be the exact same thing even. And sometimes going through some of this and saying, you guys, I know that this resistance that you're giving me is like a tried and true psychological reaction that happens. And so I'm asking you that we're gonna do some things here to ask you to try to work through that. You can email me too if you have specifics about, maybe I can, if I know what the situation is, I can maybe give you some different advice. Any other questions? And we'll do that orange shirt, and then on deck, who had their hand up? Oh, the bright, yeah, okay, then the bright guy.
You mentioned this earlier, and I just kind of wanted to share a personal experience. Respecting the past is so important, and you just talked about that earlier. My shelter's gone through a lot of changes in the last 2.5 years. 2007, our live release rate on cats was 8%. It's 80% now.
Congratulations! Good for you!
But when you have a staff that's been there for 10 years, some of them, or have been there for, even just 4 and 5, we're about a year into like the major changes, and we're having a staff meeting, and we're discussing the community and how they're still calling us killers, and and they're like, for my employees said, God, they're so stupid. People don't know. They think they know. And I'm like, they're not stupid. This was 7 years ago. This is half of a pet's lifespan that we were euthanizing, 92%.
Right.
And I also think it's just one other point. You mentioned malicious compliance, which is the first time I've heard that. It's very difficult to recognize, but it's very important. And that was the hardest thing for me, was putting too much effort into these people.
Yeah.
I spent 18 months on one person and 2.5, years on someone else, and it was a huge waste of time, So.
It sometimes is really hard to know, well, are they just nervous and in the neutral zone, or are they malicious? But the difference is when you often do know that they're doing things to sabotage, and you say, I know you may feel this way about this change, and yet you can't behave in this way. So.
Well, and I think with that, consistency is so important too, because a lot of these people, the malicious compliance, from what I've seen, are up and down.
Yeah.
Like they'll be really, really good for a month, and then they'll just drop off. But that negativity and that inconsistency just poisons your relationship.
You're absolutely right, and it's a really delicate dance between how long do I do due diligence to gain commitment versus how much toxicity is now being spread throughout my team. It's a very tough.
And I think for me, because we still have a couple people on board that have been there for a long time, it's recognizing who is the malicious compliance and setting goals in a time frame, like, okay, I'm putting this much in. If it's not, then we're moving on.
Exactly, and then they rally and they do good for a while, but ultimately, if they're not going to get on board, they'll continue the behavior. So it does take time sometimes to kick people off the bus.
Yeah, exactly.
And I think we have time for just a couple more questions. No, actually, we have a little bit of time. So next question was the.
Hey, our shelter here in Georgia, until honestly last year, it kind of in a lot of ways operated like the Wild West. We've got new operations director. I've come on board this year. And needless to say, we've already got some changes underway. We're trying to establish order, get organized and such. And I feel like, a lot of the overarching big change can be broken down into smaller bite-sized change. But with the staff and volunteers and whatnot, I'm trying to strike that balance of how many small changes are too much for them in the process. Like, do you have any pointers on telling, like, how far is too far with regards to that?
Yeah, that's a really good question. I would say I don't have any brilliant answers for that, but it's a good point that you need to be aware of. It's like, yeah, you want to create those benchmarks and herald the small changes. I think for me, it's always like, how does this small change relate to the mission and the direct life saving? Because I see this particularly in the strategic planning stage where, okay, we have the change, now we're going to strategically plan. And organizations come up with like 94 amazing initiatives that if you did all of them, you'd want to die because it's just too much. So to me, it's always running it through the mission filter and then having to be brutally brutally cut the things that don't link to, if it is, say, the goal is more direct life-saving, if it doesn't pass through that filter, you have to say, no, not now, because maybe once we get more direct life-saving, we can actually reconsider this. So it's like, it's not never, but it's no, not now. Okay, let's do purple and then pink.
Working and from other things besides animal rescue work. I don't want to sound defensive, but sometimes people come in new and want to make changes just for the sake of them. And people who've been doing the work maybe have gone through that before and said, we tried it. Now we maybe can try it again, but I still think there needs to be a healthy respect for what's been done, and said, okay, we are going to make changes, but let's be respectful in how we handle them with everybody.
Like when someone comes in and wants to prove themselves as the new leader, and that is an easy trap to fall into as a leader, because you're nervous and scared, and you want to show that you are credible and can do the right thing. I think that's why, in terms of getting the input of the people, your teams, and the people in the trenches doing the work is so critical to creating the plan and not getting too attached to your plan as a leader. So thank you for that comment. That is a great example of what I was talking about, yeah. And then pink, yeah.
Hi, this kind of goes in tone with that too. We're primarily a volunteer organization, and there's almost 1,000 volunteers, and so we like to empower our volunteers, and always have. But in the course of change, where do you cut it off? How much input do you actually give them? Because you have one group that gets mad because the other one got more input, and then they go, well, it's it should be the management's decision, but they feel it should be theirs.
That is such a great question. And I think, so do the best you can to get input equally, as equitably as you can. And very good point that I didn't mention in the presentation, I probably should have, is be very clear when you solicit that input what you're going to do with it and how much decision-making authority is attached to it. So for me, we use at Best Friends oftentimes a RACI chart that talks about who's responsible, accountable. It's kind of, you can look it up online. But bottom line is, if you say, we're gathering your input because we care, we know you have knowledge, we know that you're in the trenches and you have expertise that we don't have, we also care about how you feel, and so it's going to be this group of people who is making the ultimate decision on what we're going to actually do. Some of your input will be used, and quite frankly, some of it won't be able to be, maybe because of resource issues or because it doesn't pass through certain filters. So it is very important that when you solicit input to make it clear that we want your input, but this doesn't mean that we're going to implement everything. Now, you better implement some of it as a leader, or else your credibility goes down the drain. But you're right, to manage those expectations is very important. Thank you for that. Other questions? Comments? Well, I will be around for a little bit if you have any questions you want from me individually, and I just want to thank you so much for all the work you do, and I appreciate it.